let's go straight into the practice. As always, we begin by preparing the body. So keeping the back nice and straight. And simply allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. With the eyes at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you. Bring your attention to your own mind. and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Without following mental events, without trying to get rid of them. Simply observe them as they arise and pass. And initially we can mainly focus on the more objective type of mental events. Things like thoughts, memories, and mental images. So mainly focusing on these types of mental events. Now shift your focus and observe the more subjective type of mental events. Things like emotions, moods, and desires. What is the current state of your mind? Noticing any attachment, aversion, frustration, and so on. Now shift your focus from the foreground to the background. So now focus on the space of the mind itself, the space where these mental events arise, abide, and dissolve back into. So now primarily observe the space of the mind. Now let go of focusing on the space of the mind and simply allow the mind to come to rest, not doing anything at all. Simply be present. Simply rest in awareness itself. Simply knowing that you're aware. Now all sorts of appearances will continue to arise, but now pay no attention to any appearance. Let them be. And just rest in the experience of awareness itself. resting in the stillness of the mind. The last 4 minutes of that meditation was a brief taste of the practice we're going to do now, next, the shamatha practice of resting in awareness. But before we move on to that practice, are there any last questions about observing the mind and the mental events?
It's very unclear when you said to take on the background. I had to visualize the sky or something. I couldn't do it.
Yeah. I mean, that background is when we're having thoughts arising and one finishes, before the next one starts, if there's a gap, that is the space, that gap. Normally as a beginner there's not much of a gap, there's like thought, 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 thought. But when the mind goes quiet, that's the background. Whatever you see there, that's the space of the mind, that is the gap. Yes, and I'll talk about that, the difference, very shortly.
I focused on the background. It was a very wide and vast space, flat space.
Yeah.
And when I just finished now, I was wondering if this was me, my imagination of a black space, sort of a conceptualization of my mind doing that, or is it that?
Well, of course, that experience is an experience of an absence of mental events. So it's certainly, in terms of that, it's certainly blank in terms of no content, but if we look closely, then we can see, well, is it just some sort of voidness, or does it have some sort of quality to it? But that's something we need to see from our own direct experience.
It was fast, very black and thick.
Thick.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like that. That's it.
Yeah. So this is more now moving into Vipassana practice to investigate that. What is it really like? What qualities does it have? So that's a valid, in fact, one of the Vipassana practices that are often done in traditions that are focused on exactly this question. You know, is this space? Is it a voidness? Is it just darkness, or does it have certain qualities? And that's the instruction. But of course, no point in giving some intellectual answer. The answer is we look and we see. But that's more Vipassana practice. Okay. Let's now then move on to this last of the three shamatha practices that we're doing in this retreat. So the first one, of course, was to observe the breath. And we did the variations of full body, abdomen, nostrils, and even a bit of the rhythm of the breath. And then so far today we've been looking at the second practice, that is the object is the mind, i.e. the space of the mind and any mental events that arise in that space. The third shamatha practice we're going to start now, and also do tomorrow morning a little bit, is it's often called shamatha with no object, or sometimes it's called awareness of awareness practice. Now, we're explicitly aware of objects, and implicitly we're aware of being aware of the objects. For example, when we're focusing on the breath, we're explicitly aware of the breath, and implicitly we're aware of being aware of the breath. And when we're observing the mind and the mental events, explicitly we're aware of the mental events, and implicitly we're aware of being aware of those. So all we're doing in this last practice is we're explicitly being aware of being aware. Now, many people find this even more challenging than observing the mind or the breath, not because it's complicated, but actually because it's too simple. Because this practice basically involves doing nothing. We don't really know how to do nothing. We always want to do something. So often when this practice is explained, people say, yes, but what have I got to do? Tell me what I've got to do. Doing is the problem. Stop doing, and then you're in the practice. So this is not so much about doing, it's about being. Simply being present, knowing that we're aware. That's it. So let's do a little 5-second experiment of knowing that we're aware. You don't have to sit in any posture for this. So we'll just start the experiment now. Okay, finish. Did you know you were aware? Were you completely asleep or blanked out? Or did you know that you were aware?
I said to myself, I'm aware.
Do we have to say that we're aware to know that we're aware?
I'm telling you what I did.
Yeah.
In order to be awakened,
Yeah.
I was telling myself, be aware, be aware.
And like all the other practices, in the beginning stage, a little bit of commentary is useful to tell us what to do. But we don't need to tell ourselves to be aware. But in the beginning, it could be helpful to occasionally say, be aware, because otherwise we're probably following some thought or falling asleep or something. But that's it. That's the practice. That's all that is. That's it. That's the practice. Just know that you're aware. All we got to do is continue to do that. That's it. Now, of course, in this practice, all sorts of things will arise. Thoughts, emotions, memories, sensations, sounds. In this practice, we're not interested in any appearance. We're not interested in sensations, sounds, thoughts, emotions, memories. we just ignore them. Let them be. Don't pay any attention to them. Of course, we're not trying to block them, but we're not paying any attention to them. We are simply resting in the experience of awareness itself. Simply knowing that we're aware. That's it. That's all we've got to do. Now, the question was before, what's the difference between that and observing the space of awareness? The difference is a little bit experiential in the sense that when we are observing the space of awareness, or the space of the mind, that experience is very much a dualistic experience. Just like when we're observing the breath, there's a sense of me observing this object breath. Observing the thoughts and emotions, me observing these objects, thoughts and emotions. And even the space is me observing this space. So it's very much experientially a very dualistic experience. Whereas resting in awareness experientially is much more a non-dualistic experience. There's not really a sense of being a separate observer. So using the analogy of the sky, observing the space of the mind is like looking at observing the sky. Resting in awareness is like being the sky. So experientially, there's a little bit of a different flavour to it. So there's a couple of questions down the back.
So we kind of practiced it right here, right?
Yeah, the last 4 minutes of that meditation was that.
Yes, and I felt like I was really into it. But then what happened was that I was like, okay, I am being. I see this and I have no thoughts. But wait, he said, don't use the sight.
Don't use the
sight.
Oh, the visual.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not looking at anything.
Exactly. I was like, I'm not supposed to be using my senses, and then I thought maybe I'm not being, maybe I'm somewhere else. So how do I know that I'm being if I'm not using my senses?
If you're in a sensory deprivation tank, do you know you're in a sensory deprivation tank?
Well, yeah, I have like
Right, so you don't need the senses. You don't need the senses to be aware, do you? No. So, in this practice, we're being aware. We don't need the senses to be aware. And in this practice, remember, it's a shamatha practice. So we're not entertaining the question, where is this awareness? Is it in my head? Is it over there? Is it everywhere, somewhere? This is Vipassana practice. So we're not interested in questioning in this practice. That is, in fact, a valid question, and one of the questions that we do in Vipassana, which we're actually going to do this questioning on Saturday morning, this very questioning. Where is this awareness? Is it inside the head? Is it there, here? Where is it? So this is Vipassana practice. So we can leave that out here. We're not in shamatha practice. We're not interested in asking these questions. We're just resting in that experience.
Well, no, that wasn't my
Sure.
question was, I mean, how is it supposed to actually feel? Like, here I thought I am there, but then I realized I'm actually using my sight as something to make me feel like I'm being there.
Right.
So-
But again, we're just resting. We're just knowing that we're aware. We don't need senses to know that we're aware, do we? So just leave the senses out.
Can we close our eyes when we do the
Again, for this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open for the same reasons as the last practice. Because with the eyes open, more clarity. With the eyes closed, then we have a sense of me in here and the world out there. Also, then it's much easier to drift in the past and future. And also with the eyes open, resting in awareness, we can much easier bring it into daily life. So for these reasons, again, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open, same as with the previous practice.
Another question, what's the difference between that meditation and just sitting meditation?
Just sitting.
Like open awareness.
Open awareness is we are observing whatever appears in our mind. So open awareness, if a thought comes, we look at that. The sound comes, we hear, focus on that sensation. We're focusing on all 6 types of objects. This practice is focusing on the awareness, not the appearances to the awareness. So we're sort of turning awareness in on itself rather than outwards to the objects. So in that open awareness, we're explicitly aware of all the appearances to awareness. Now we're just turning it back on itself and being aware of itself. So we're not interested in any appearances.
What is the purpose of open awareness?
Open awareness generally is a good daily life practice to not get caught up in appearances. So that, you know, for the practice we just did, particularly observing the mind, then the daily life practice of that would be more this open awareness, and that is whatever's coming up in the mind in daily life, whether it's a thought, emotion, some sensation, sound, and so forth, just to observe that. So in the practice that we just did, we narrowed down the open awareness from the 6 types of objects, the 5 sense and mental, just to the mental, because it's more efficient, more effective in developing concentration. Open awareness in meditation is good, but not as effective as in narrowing down what we focus on for shamatha practice.
I just want to make sure I understood correctly. So the last 4 minutes we did were observing the sky?
No, the last 4, we did, first we observed objective mental events, then subjective mental events, then we were observing the sky, and then we were being the sky, the last 4 minutes.
Okay, so observing the mind, like last.
Observing the background,
Yeah, observing.
that is observing the sky,
Yeah.
and then the last 4 minutes we let go of that and we just being the sky.
So one is looking at awareness and one is being aware?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, it's really the same, it's the same thing, but experientially they feel different. One feels more dualistic and the other one is more non-dualistic. I mean, we're not looking at 2 different things. When we're observing the space of the mind or we're resting in awareness, we're not observing 2 different things, but experientially it feels different.
I once heard an instruction for shamatha that when you're on the breath, at some point you have to be the breath.
Be the breath.
So it's like a similar idea.
That sounds a bit awkward to me. Be the breath. Be the breath. That doesn't really sound like a shamatha instruction to me. That sounds a bit more like Vipassana in terms of not having a sense of duality between you and the breath. So I think that's not a shamatha instruction. That would be more of a Vipassana instruction.
It feels like me like a Zen riddle.
A Zen?
Riddle. I'm not.
Oh, a koan or something.
Yes, I don't
Right.
understand what's being.
Okay, so let me introduce
the sky awareness.
let me introduce the practice a little bit more from reading from Alan Wallace and maybe some more questions. So let's see what he says about this practice. So this is on page 131. He says, if you wish to continue in settling the mind in its natural state, which is the practice we were doing before, this practice can take you all the way to the achievement of shamatha. But I shall now present an alternative practice that you may find an even more potent way to balance your attention to perfection. Padmasambhava calls this technique the cultivation of shamatha without a sign. So Padmasambhava was the great Indian master in the 8th century who first brought Buddhism to Tibet. In this context, the term sign refers to an object of attention that can be identified within a conceptual framework. The tactile sensations of the breath are a sign. So is the space of the mind and the mental events that arise within that space. In both those practices, the attention is directed to an object other than itself and stability and clarity are cultivated in relation to that object. In the practice of shamatha without a sign, the attention is not directed to anything. It rests in its own nature, simply being aware of its own presence. Nominally, you could say that awareness takes itself as its object, but experientially, this practice is more a matter of taking no object. You simply let your awareness rest without any referent in its own innate luminosity and cognizance. While Padmasambhava presents this as a method for achieving shamatha, it is also an effective method for illuminating the nature of awareness itself. So what we find in this practice is simply resting in the experience of awareness itself. It's a shamatha practice. So the goal is to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind. But one of the side benefits of simply resting in awareness itself is that we can intuitively come to an understanding of the very nature of our own mind, which of course is Vipassana practice. So this practice is very much a bridge into the Vipassana practice. So he says a little bit more about the practice here. So let's read that. That's on page 144. He says, here are quintessential instructions by Padmasambhava on the practice of shamatha with no object apart from awareness itself. So now he's quoting Padmasambhava, who says, vacantly direct your eyes in the space in front of you. So same thing as the previous practice, rest your gaze in the space in front of you. And he says, see that thoughts pertaining to the past, future and present, as well as wholesome, unwholesome and ethically neutral thoughts, together with all the causes, assembly and dispersal of thoughts of the three times, are completely cut off. Cut off doesn't mean to block thoughts, it means don't pay any attention to them. He says, bring no concepts to mind. Let the mind, like a cloudless sky, be clear, empty, and evenly devoid of grasping, and settle it into utter vacuity. By so doing, there arises the shamatha of joy, luminosity, and non-conceptuality. So, as I briefly mentioned yesterday, when we're practicing shamatha, whether we're focusing on the breath or mind or any other object, three qualities of mind will become more and more manifest. And they were clarity, non-conceptuality, bliss. So as we go deeper into the shamatha practice, what you'll find is you start to have a little taste of each one of these. Sometimes your mind will seem very clear. At other times it will seem very still and non-conceptual. Other times very blissful and joyful. And so when we are practicing the mind, or practicing observing the mind or observing the breath, we can be said to cultivate these qualities. But this practice is more about discovering these qualities that are already there. So that's a little bit different perspective. So this practice of resting in awareness is just noticing those qualities that are there at the deeper level, because we are coming into contact with those qualities. So any questions about this practice before we try it out?
I have a question about introspection here.
Right.
Because is there any quality that I should inspect, and if I should, is just it's doing instead of being?
So again, introspection is the same job in this practice. Because also in this practice we can get very dull and we can get caught up in distractions. So same thing. If we notice we're getting caught up in any appearance and off we go, then let go and come back, or we're going very dull, to sharpen focus. So same.
So how am I supposed to not have any expectations from meditation after all this?
Because expectation is another type of grasping. So if expectation comes up, we can, if we're doing the mind practice, we just observe it. Here, we just ignore it. We don't pay any attention to it. Easy. Right. Yeah.
You're saying that when I'm aware of my awareness, it's non-dual, right? But
Well,
there are two things.
yeah.
There are two things here. It's being
Well,
aware and the
yeah, but in Vipassana practice, you know, using language, we have to describe the practice. So we talk about the awareness that is observed and the awareness that is observing. So with language, we create that duality. But what we're talking about here is experientially